Tonight's presentation will be about 90 minutes. There will be several moderated panel questions, so there will not be time for audience questions. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civic series is supported by Real Network Foundation, True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and Wyncote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Colleen Echohawk is the Executive Director of the Chief Seattle Club, a nonprofit dedicated to the needs of Native American and Alaskan Native people who are experiencing homelessness in Seattle. She is an enrolled member of the Kickahocky Band of the Pawnee Nation and a member of the Upper Athabascan people of Minnetonka Lake. She also founded the Coalition to End Urban Native Homelessness. Teresa Mosqueda is Budget Chair of the Seattle City Council, elected in 2017. Her top priority on City Council is promoting healthy communities, uplifting working families, and creating more affordable housing for all residents through the city. She chairs the Housing and Finance Committee and is a member of the National League of Cities. Claudia Balducci is chair of the King County Council. She is a leader in transportation and affordable housing, and a strong advocate for education and the arts. She serves as chair of the Sound Transit Board System Expansion Committee, vice president of the Puget Sound Regional Council, and chair of the county's Affordable Housing Committee. Michael Brown is the chief architect of Civic Commons at the Seattle Foundation, a regional civic infrastructure aimed at uniting more community voices in decision-making to advance racial and economic equity. He has led efforts to tackle complex challenges in the areas of affordable housing, economic and racial equity, policy, and advocacy. Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, along with a discussion of how this history directly impacts housing in Seattle, is the topic of tonight's talk. With that, we'll hand things over to Patience Malabaugh with the Housing Development Consortium to introduce Richard Rothstein.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the 5th Affordable Housing Week kickoff and happy Indigenous Peoples Day. It is a great honor to welcome you today on behalf of the board and staff of HDC. This is a special day each year for housing advocates, elected officials, and community members to come together to kick off Affordable Housing Week and talk about the regional housing crisis, and more importantly, how to address this crisis. This year, we're starting off with the history of housing segregation today, to examine how the legacy of redlining impacts Seattle's housing crisis and how many in our region are struggling to afford a safe and healthy home. I would like to thank all of you gathered here today. It is heartening to see so many people coming together to join this movement for housing justice. As an association of 190 members, HDC recognizes that achieving our vision of ensuring that all people live with dignity in safe, healthy, and affordable homes within communities of opportunity requires all of us to do our part. After all, we are stronger together. I want to take a moment to recognize our partners in co-hosting this event: Seattle for Everyone, Pacifica Law Group, West Coast Poverty Law Center, Whatcom Housing Alliance, and of course, Town Hall Seattle. And now I would like to recognize and thank the generosity of our affordable housing sponsors: JP Morgan Chase, Beacon Group, BECU, the City of Renton, Renton Housing Authority, Deacon, Mercy Housing, SKL Architects, and Weber Thompson. And of course, I'll be remiss not to recognize the extraordinary dedication and commitment of the HDC staff. This evening, we are delighted to have with us Richard Rothstein, who has written a very important, very provocative, and must-read book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Contrary to what many believe, Mr. Rothstein boldly states a case that segregated neighborhoods in this country did not primarily result from individual prejudices, personal choices, or actions just by private institutions, but rather they were a consequence of public policy, a purposeful, systematic, and forceful government action. You may ask yourself how that could be. After all, racial segregation by state action is unconstitutional. Well, that has become more clear now. And you will note that in his book, he does mention that there are some Supreme Court justices that have remained ill-informed about the role of government in racial segregation of housing. And they've also remained ill-informed about the devastating impacts on the lives of Black Americans, which is even more apparent today. In the wake of a racial reckoning, and in particular, a reckoning with anti-Black racism, we are at a precipitous moment. We are at a historic time of opportunity to reimagine, reform, and ensure systemic change that builds on our years of hard work within our region and cities with both urgency and determination. There are some notable points of work that I want to reference and call on you to think about as we sit here today. In the city of Seattle in 2018, led by Councilmember Mosqueda, we dedicated funding for a racial equity toolkit analysis of the urban village growth strategy to look at the equity impacts of how we're growing as a city. In 2019, we doubled down with more funding to ensure that the comprehensive plan update was looking at how we could increase more housing choices in single-family zones and making sure that there were strong anti-displacement measures put in place. Speeding up to that work, we have seen some efforts around renaming single-family zones and preparing for the 2024 work. At regional level, we saw extensive work led by Councilmember Balducci on the Regional Affordable Housing Task Force, looking at the scale of need. And they followed up and doubled down with an Affordable Housing Committee that has been hard at work in making sure that they are implementing the actions that were adopted. And that very group is also working on the county-wide planning policies. There's a lot of other work that I can mention that is led by nonprofits across the region in ensuring that people have access to housing in particular during this time. But as a community, in separate spaces that we're in today, in one of the most challenging times, I invite you to listen, learn, and reflect on the history of housing segregation and the continued impacts on our communities. I invite you to think about how you will contribute to the collective efforts of undoing past harms. Having said that, allow me to introduce Richard Rothstein, who is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow at the Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In addition to his recent book, The Color of Law, he is the author of many other articles and books on race and education, which can be found at his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute, www.epi.org. Mr. Rothstein, we are so glad to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patience. It's really a pleasure to be here with you this evening. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I have been looking forward to coming to Seattle, but this will have to do. Let me begin by reminding all of us that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, then in colleges and universities, And then in 1954, as you all know, in the Brown versus Board of Education's decision, civil rights litigators succeeded in prohibiting legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown decision then gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists. They engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. Some civil rights activists lost their lives in that struggle, as you know. But by the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement had pretty much convinced much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. As a result of that awareness and the militancy of the movement, it succeeded in ending segregation in lunch counters and buses, that is, public accommodations, interstate transportation, swimming pools, water fountains. And in 1968, it succeeded in getting a fair housing law passed that prohibited ongoing segregation in the sale and rental of housing. And yet, at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement came to a close pretty much and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white, mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all black or mostly black. How could it be? We came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And yet we left untouched the biggest segregation of all. Well, partly it's because it's hard to undo residential segregation. If we abolish segregation in restaurants, the next day you go to any restaurant you want. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, liberals, conservatives, blacks and whites, Northerners, Southerners, Easterners, Westerners, is we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves to avoid confronting the fact that we're an apartheid society, that we are residentially segregated systematically everywhere in the country. And the rationalization we give ourselves goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of schools and colleges and restaurants and buses, and that was all done by government. If the federal government was doing it, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, civil rights violation, and unconstitutional. And if we have a civil rights violation, we have an obligation to do something about it. If state and local governments were doing it, there's a 14th Amendment violation, also a civil rights violation, also something we have an obligation to undo. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. It wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. We became residentially segregated sort of naturally, by accident. Of course, bigotry was involved. White homeowners and landlords wouldn't sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods or rent to them, or businesses in the private economy like real estate agencies or banks discriminated in how they carried out their private economic activities, not the governmental activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because blacks and whites, we just like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. And so we choose neighborhoods that are people just like us in skin color. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all because of economic differences. African Americans, on average, have smaller incomes, lower incomes than whites, on average. And therefore, many African Americans can't afford to move to all white neighborhoods or majority white neighborhoods. And that's why we're segregated. All of these individual, bigoted, but nonetheless non-governmental decisions, actions, is what created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We give a name to this rationalization. We say that what we have in terms of residential racial boundaries is de facto segregation, the term that we all use, happened in fact, not in law. Well, I used to spend most of my time not studying housing policy, but studying and writing about education policy. That was my specialty. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I spent a lot of time writing, criticizing the dominant education policy in this country. And the education policy of this country at the time, and to a certain extent still is, that the reason we have lower average achievement of African American than white children, we call it an achievement gap. The reason for the achievement gap is because teachers have low expectations of Black children. They're bigoted. They don't just try very hard to teach Black children. And we told ourselves that only if we could make teachers work harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory, but it was widely accepted. It was considered a civil rights view, that if only we could make teachers work harder, the achievement gap would disappear. We enacted a law, a national law, that embedded this theory. It was called the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. It required us to test children every year and hold teachers and schools accountable for those test scores. And the law predicted that if we did that, the achievement gap would disappear in a matter of just a couple of years. It was, as I say, a ludicrous theory. And I tried to explain in many of the columns I was writing that that's not the reason we have an achievement gap. Of course, there are some bigoted teachers, but the primary reason we have an achievement gap is because so many African American children come to school with such serious social and economic disadvantages that impede their ability to take advantage of what good schools have to offer. So I remember writing one column about asthma. As you may know, African American children in urban neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods in this country have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. They have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through their neighborhoods, more dilapidated buildings, more empty lots with dirt kicking up dirt, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who does not have asthma, it's not true of every child, but more likely to be up at night wheezing, coming to school the next day drowsy. And I tried to explain in this column, if you had 2 groups of children, identical groups, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group had a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement by a small amount because that group's going to be sleepier in school. Well, that wouldn't make a big difference. But then when you begin to think of all of the conditions that have a similar impact on achievement, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning, which has a measurable impact on IQ, or homelessness, or economic insecurity, once you've added up all of these things, you've got an explanation for most of the achievement gap. Well, I was thinking about that, and then I realized that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. But what happens if you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity? How can you ever expect that school to have achievement that's comparable to the achievement of a school where children come well-rested, healthy, well-nourished, in secure homes? It's obviously impossible to have that expectation no matter how many laws we pass saying that it's true. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And the reality is that schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that neighborhood segregation was an educational problem. I still wasn't thinking much about housing. I was trying to see this as simply as an educational problem. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that involved your city, Seattle, and another city, Louisville, Kentucky. The Supreme Court evaluated a program that both the Seattle School District and the Louisville School District implemented to try to, in a very token way, desegregate their schools. Very trivial program. Gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child or your child would attend. But if that choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't. do so. So if you had a school that was all white or mostly white, and both a black and a white child, for example, applied for the last remaining place, the black child would be given some preference. Trivial program. But the Supreme Court examined this program, denounced it, said that Seattle and Louisville could not do such a thing. It was unconstitutional for them to do such a thing. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the controlling opinion in this case. He said it's true, the schools in Seattle and Louisville are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. But he said those neighborhoods are segregated de facto for all the reasons I described a few minutes ago, private bigotry, actions of private businesses, self-choice, income differences. And he said, if you have de facto segregation, something in which the government was not involved, simply created in the private economy, it's a violation of the Constitution for the government to explicitly try to change it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered something that happened some years before, actually not in Seattle, but in Louisville. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was an all-white suburb outside Louisville called Shively. In this suburb, there was a white homeowner who had an African-American friend living in downtown Louisville. The African-American friend had was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in this suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop any of this activity. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence, the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the prosecutors, the courts are all being mobilized to enforce racial boundaries in Louisville, Kentucky. And I began to look into it further and found that there were hundreds and hundreds of cases throughout the country, some in Seattle as late as 1964, of police-protected mob violence driving African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in previously white neighborhoods. Every one of these where the police was involved was a constitutional violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment, something that we as American citizens have an obligation to remedy, but we've never done so. And then as I began to look into it further, I discovered that it was not just police-sponsored, state-sponsored violence that was responsible for the segregation that we have today, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies explicitly designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another anywhere in this country in metropolitan areas. There were so many of these policies, they interacted so forcefully, their effects are felt to a great extent still today, that I concluded that the notion of de facto segregation is an utter myth. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. We have an unconstitutional system of state-created, state-sponsored, state-sustained racial segregation in residences, in neighborhoods, and we as American citizens, all of us, have an obligation to remedy it. Well, in the few minutes that I have with you this evening, let me describe a few of the most powerful policies that the federal government followed in order to impose segregation on this country. And there were many, many others that I won't describe, that I've described in my book, The Color of Law. One of them is public housing, something that we all misunderstand. In most of our view, public housing is a place where poor people live, where lots of mothers, single mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy, lots of dilapidated buildings. That's our image of public housing for the most part, but that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country during the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration, during the Depression. It was not for poor people. We had a 25% unemployment rate during the Depression. very high even compared to today. Public housing was not for the unemployed. Public housing was for the 75% who had good jobs, stable incomes, could afford to pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. It was for working class and middle class families. The reason we needed public housing during the Depression was because there was no economic activity to speak of going on in the housing market. And so there was a shortage. Housing wasn't being built, and the federal government stepped in and began to build housing for working and middle class families who could demonstrate that they could pay the full cost of rent. It was not a subsidized program. But everywhere that the federal government built public housing throughout the 1930s and on, it was segregated. Separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. And that may surprise you. It's another misunderstanding we have about history, but we had a lot more integration in neighborhoods in the mid-early 20th centuries than we have today. The reason is not hard to understand when you think about it. We were a manufacturing economy. It may be hard for you to imagine this in Seattle, but we didn't have any of this internet stuff in those days. You know, we were making things, and factories had to be located near a deep water port or a railroad terminal so that they could get their parts and ship their final products either by rail or by ship. And so if you had a factory district that was employing both Black and white workers, those workers had to live relatively nearby so they could walk to work or maybe take short streetcar rides. They didn't have automobiles to drive in for the suburbs. There were no working class or even lower middle class families living in the suburbs in those days. So when the federal government built segregated housing, it frequently was segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously had that kind of segregation. In his autobiography, the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes describes how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. That's not how we think of Cleveland today. We don't think of it as having a downtown integrated neighborhood. But the Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and created segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Langston Hughes describes how in high school, he went to an integrated high school where his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. It's what you'd expect to find in an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. But the Public Works Administration built two separate projects in that neighborhood, one for whites, one for Blacks, creating a pattern of segregation where it hadn't previously existed. In my book, The Color of Law, I like where I can to talk about self-satisfied smug places. They think they're better than every place else. Maybe you've heard of one of them, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white, half Black. Public Works Administration and subsequent federal agencies in the 1930s built two projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation there that hadn't previously existed. During World War II, the federal government intensified its program to create segregation. During the war, war plants were created around the country to create planes and ships and aircraft carriers and jeeps and tanks. They overwhelmed the communities where these war plants were located. Government had to build housing for them, and almost everywhere, the government built segregated housing, separate projects for whites, separate projects for Blacks, creating segregation again where it hadn't previously existed. In many of these places, there was very few African Americans living prior to World War II. That was the case on the West Coast for sure. If you know the history of the migration of African Americans out of the South into the rest of the country, the substantial migration of African Americans to the West Coast came during World War II, not prior to that. So when the federal government created segregation through its war plant housing, it was creating it on a basis of a community that hadn't previously known it. In San Francisco, for example, the federal government built 5 projects for war workers, mostly shipyard workers. Black and white were working together in the shipyards, but the government built 4 projects for whites only and 1 for African Americans, placing it in a district that became the Black neighborhood of San Francisco, hadn't previously been so. And the same thing was done in Los Angeles and Portland, and to some extent in Seattle as well, up and down the West Coast. After World War II, there was still a serious housing shortage. No housing had been built during the Depression, except for the public projects I mentioned. During World War II, it was against the law to use civilian materials for construction of housing unless it was for war workers. Use materials in the civilian economy except for war workers. And then after World War II, there were millions of returning war veterans coming home, needing housing. There was an enormous housing shortage, like one we have today. People weren't living in cars. They didn't have cars for the most part, but returning war veterans were living in open fields and Quonset huts, doubled, tripled up with relatives the same way we have today in our housing crisis. The federal government felt it had to respond to this. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, proposed an expansion, a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program, always segregated. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's proposal for expanded public housing. Not for racial reasons. They were content that it was segregated, not because they didn't like poor people. It was not for poor people. People were still paying the full cost of housing and their rent. It wasn't yet a subsidized program. They wanted to defeat it because they considered public housing socialistic. They said the private market should be taking care of the housing of returning war veterans, even though the private market was not doing so. And so they came up with a proposal in Congress. We refer to it as a poison pill strategy that they used. A poison pill strategy is one where in Congress, opponents of a bill put forward an amendment that they think can get a majority. And then when the amendment is passed and becomes part of the final bill, a different majority finds the final bill objectionable because of that amendment, and so the bill goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment to Truman's 1949 Housing Act that said from now on, there can't be any racial discrimination in public housing. The end of racial discrimination. It was a cynical move, a cynical amendment. They didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for this amendment. They planned to have Northern liberal Democrats join with them and vote against the discrimination in public housing. That would create a majority to pass the amendment. And then when the full bill came up on the floor of Congress, the conservatives planned to flip and vote against the final bill. They thought they could be joined then by Southern Democrats who would oppose integrated public housing, but not segregated public housing. And the entire bill would go down to defeat. So liberals in Congress had a very difficult choice to make. Were they going to support the non-discrimination amendment and ensure that no housing would be built to address the very serious housing crisis that existed around the country? Or were they going to oppose the non-discrimination amendment in order to preserve the expansion of public housing? I'm not suggesting it was an easy choice, but they decided to oppose the non-discrimination amendment. And the leading liberal in the Senate at that time, Senator Paul Douglas, got up on the floor of the Senate and gave a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the non-discrimination amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than if the amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, I don't think we've been so better off. He couldn't have foreseen it, but the consequences of the vast expansion of segregation in housing that was led by the public housing program has had enormous consequences for today. The federal government used that vote in Congress as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs, not just public housing, into the 1960s. Well, the consequences of this decision, this devil's bargain that we made to trade integration of public housing for the possibility of expanding it, not only produced the achievement gap in schools that I described before, it produced health disparities between African Americans and whites. So many African Americans, on average, they have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in so many dangerous, polluted neighborhoods It predicts the mass incarceration crisis and police abuse that we spent so much time protesting about in the last few months. I'm not suggesting that police would never discriminate against African-American men if it were not for the segregation that we created, but much more intense because we concentrate most disadvantaged in single neighborhoods without access to jobs or transportation to get to good jobs or schools with high achieving students. I think that the intensification of segregation that came about as a result of that well-meaning vote in Congress this also has a very, very dangerous and frightening impact today on our very lives, all of us, and that is the extreme political polarization that exists in this country. That it's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop, to maintain, to sustain the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other? That we have no ability to understand each other's life experiences, to empathize with each other, to develop, as I say, a common national identity. But that was the consequence of the choice that we made in 1949 to encapsulate into law a policy of segregation in all federal housing programs. Well, public housing was vastly expanded under that 1949 Act on a segregated basis. And I'm sure many of you are familiar all across the country with these projects, high rises in many places. Perhaps the most famous of them is Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. It became notorious as a vertical slum where we concentrated the poorest families in St. Louis. But Pruitt-Igoe was not one project. There was two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans. Igoe was for whites. And this was the pattern everywhere in the country. Well, very soon after that, those projects were built in the early 1950s as a result of the 1949 Housing Act. A development occurred that was quite surprising to policy experts, to housing experts. And that was that all of the Black projects, like Pruitt, had long waiting lists. We didn't build enough housing to take care of the housing crisis. But the white projects developed large numbers of vacancies. Soon, even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't justify a situation where some of his buildings had long waiting lists and others were half empty. So soon all the projects were opened up to African Americans. Public housing became, as whites left, a predominantly African American institution in much of the country. At about the same time, industry left the cities, no longer necessarily dependent on deep water ports or railroad terminals because highways were being built and industry could move to rural areas and to suburban areas. So the African American population that was concentrated now in inner cities as whites left became poorer and poorer. Public housing had to be subsidized because the families could no longer afford to pay the housing and their rent. And once it became subsidized, the government stopped investing in it, stopped maintaining it, the buildings deteriorated, and we got the vertical slums that we come to identify with public housing. But that's not how it began. It's not how it needs to be. We should remember that public housing is not necessarily a place where we have to concentrate and warehouse the poorest families in this country. Well, the question that I devote most of my book to answering is why did all those white projects develop large numbers of vacancies and the Black projects didn't? These were all returning war veterans, Black and white, who were living in public housing, for whom the housing was designed. Why all the white vacancies? And that was because primarily of another federal program that was equally racially explicit. It was a federal program that was designed explicitly on a racial basis to move the white working class and middle class population out of cities into single family homes in all white suburbs like that one in Shively that I talked about before. This was an explicitly racial program. The federal government wanted to move white families out of urban areas into single family homes in suburbs and prohibit African Americans from joining them in that movement. You're familiar with all of these suburbs. They were built in Seattle. William Boeing built suburbs north of the city. Companies like the South Seattle Land Corporation and the Puget Mill Company built these suburbs as well, all with federal subsidies. These developers could never have developed the capital on their own to build these giant suburbs. The biggest of them was Levittown, east of New York City. You may have heard of that one. It was 17,000 homes in one place. On the West Coast, there were equally large developments like that. In Los Angeles, perhaps you've heard of Lakewood, or in San Francisco, Daly City, the Westlake development in Daly City. Levittown, for example, was 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend William Levitt the money to build 17,000 homes, for which he had no buyers, in a project that people thought was crazy because we were in a suburban country at that time, and nobody thought that working class families would want to move to suburban homes? He couldn't get the financing to build this project. The only way that Levitt, and this is true of all these other developers all across the country, on the West Coast, on the East Coast, and the Midwest, the only way they could get the money to build these suburban communities that ringed every city in the country was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting their plans for the development. The plans had to include the architectural design, the materials they were going to use, the layout of the streets, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required these developers to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats in the Federal Housing Administration or Veterans Administration. It was explicit racial policy. The federal government had a manual distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend the application of builders to create suburban communities. The manual said that appraisers could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that was going to be integrated. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that was going to be all white if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the federal policy manual, the underwriting manual, that would, quote, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation, as I say, is utter nonsense. There is no basis in reality to it whatsoever. In the communities I talked about before in Seattle, the deed said that no property in said addition, as I'm talking about the Boeing and the South Seattle Land Company and the Puget Mill developments, said no property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. And these deeds are in these homes today. You can look them up in their public records. The Civil Rights Project, the Seattle Civil Rights Project, that the University of Seattle, of Washington, has identified many of them, put them on the website. They're easily available to be seen. This was a federal government requirement. The notion of de facto segregation, as I say, is nonsense. Well, these suburban homes that were created by the federal government under this program in every metropolitan area of this country were inexpensive. They were designed primarily for returning war veterans, of whom there were millions, people needing housing in the post-war boom. They cost at the time roughly $100,000 in today's money. Well, as you know, these homes no longer sell for $100,000 in any of the suburbs, either in Seattle or in New York or in Chicago or in Detroit or anywhere else. Depending on the part of the country, they sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, maybe $1 million and more in some places. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the equity and the appreciation of the value of their homes. Most Americans, not the super rich, but most Americans who have any wealth, get most of it from the equity they have in the homes they own. The white families use that equity to send their children to college, They use it to take care of emergencies, perhaps temporary unemployment or a medical emergency. If you have wealth, you can weather temporary unemployment. If you don't have wealth, you push further down the economic scale as a result of temporary unemployment. The white families use that wealth to subsidize their retirements, and they use that wealth to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today African American incomes on average are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story about constitutional violations that created that income gap as well. I don't have time to talk about that today, but you'd think that if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People have the same ability to save money out of the same incomes. But in reality, although African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, that we have an obligation to remedy because as American citizens, we're obligated to enforce our Constitution, to abide by its protections against civil rights violations. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. Policymakers know what they are. Housing experts know what they are. The journalists write about them all the time. What's missing is not policy ideas about how to redress segregation. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to, in the words of John Lewis that we spent so much time memorializing a few months ago, make good trouble to make it uncomfortable, unsustainable, to maintain the residential patterns that we have not only in Seattle, but in every metropolitan area of the country. Let me give you one example. It will seem absurd to you, I know, because we're so far from being able to implement policies to redress segregation. I'll give you one example of something that I think is perfectly constitutionally justified, and I can say that although I'm not a lawyer, I've spoken to many, many constitutional lawyers, given talks at the ABA, the American Bar Association about this. Nobody has ever said that this is not a reasonable proposal. So let me tell you what the federal government should do. In these suburbs that sold to whites only for $100,000 in the mid-20th century and now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 for homes, federal government should be buying up homes in these communities in proportion to the African American population in the broader area. Buy up homes at market rates and resell them to qualified African Americans for $100,000 or something close to that. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. It would be an affirmative action program in housing. There would be, as I say, constitutionally justified once this history became recognized, once this history became well known. When the courts, as in the example I gave at the very beginning of this talk about the Seattle and Louisville school desegregation case, when the courts prohibit explicit federal policy to redress segregation, they do so on the basis of denying that the federal government had any involvement in creating the segregation. Once they're forced to recognize that the federal government did have a chief role in creating the segregation, affirmative action policies in housing would be perfectly well justified. We also have programs at the low end of the income scale, not for middle class and working class African Americans who might be subsidized to move to homes that they could afford at more reasonable prices. But at the low income level end of the scale, we have programs that subsidize housing for families disproportionately African American and increasingly Hispanic. The biggest one is the low-income housing tax credit, a program that's administered by the Federal Treasury Department. It's a subsidy that the Treasury Department distributes to states. Many of you are familiar with this program, I know. And the states then distribute them to developers to build housing for low-income families. Absurdly, the Treasury Department regulations place a priority on putting more low-income housing units with these tax credits into existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. It doesn't say it's doing it for racial reasons. It has a theory that if you build all your low-income housing in low-income neighborhoods, it will improve the housing in those neighborhoods. Of course, it will, and we should improve housing in low-income neighborhoods, but we shouldn't be improving housing only in low-income neighborhoods. We should be creating opportunities for families who want to do so to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods where there's access to transportation, jobs, grocery stores that sell fresh food, excuse me, schools with high achievement. We should have the opposite priority. One of the reasons that we don't do it, not the only reason, but one of the reasons we don't do it, is because many of the suburban communities that were originally created at a low price, that is $100,000 a piece for relatively modest homes, have since adopted zoning ordinances to reinforce and perpetuate their segregation. They prohibit the subsequent construction of anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes, making it impossible to build not just housing for low-income families, but housing for working-class families, for middle-class families, for teachers and nurses and construction workers, many of whom are African-American, who have been excluded from these neighborhoods in the past and now continue to be excluded, not because we any longer have a racially explicit prohibition, but because zoning ordinances prohibit anybody from building housing for families of that kind, with those kinds of incomes. So these policies, as I say, are well known. In my judgment, if we have a zoning ordinance that perpetuates an unconstitutionally created segregation, that zoning ordinance is itself subject to constitutional challenge. Not under the current courts that we have, but in the long run, as we build more and more understanding and more good trouble around this issue, the courts will have to adopt it. Let me conclude by saying that I'm involved with a group of national civil rights leaders to create a new national committee to redress racial segregation in neighborhoods. It will be based on organizing local committees and supporting local committees where they exist to address segregation. It'll have four components. One is improving the resources in low-income communities. The second is preventing massive displacement from gentrification in low-income communities. Third is opening up opportunities in predominantly white, higher opportunity communities for African-American residents. And fourth, stabilizing integration in the few places where it exists. If any of you would like to be on the notification list when we announce the launch of this national committee, you should let me know. My email address is widely available on the web, and I would look forward to hearing from you. I want to thank you for your attention to these thoughts that I have, and I look forward to the discussion that's now going to follow. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. I don't even know if I have the words to capture just how powerful that presentation was. So thank you for that and for also sticking with us on this panel. For those of you who came in maybe halfway through, my name is Michael Brown, and I'm going to moderate tonight's panel. We're joined by Colleen Echohawk, who is the Executive Director of the Chief Seattle Club. We're joined by Claudia Balducci, who is a King County Council member and currently the chair of the King County Council. And we are joined by Teresa Mosqueda, who is a Seattle City Council member and also the budget chair of the Seattle City Council. So I want to start off with just kind of a rapid fire answer from each of you. What's your high level takeaway from Richard's presentation, what we just heard?
I'll jump in because it's like listening to my life a little bit when I hear this presentation, because I'm a person who grew up in one of those post-war suburbs and not far from Levittown, actually, and lives in another one here in Lake Hills, Bellevue. And just what you could see on the ground, just living your life day by day about the segregation that occurred because of the kind of policies that just seemed to us growing up in it like that's just the way things are. It was very, very effective at dramatically segregating people by race, and that was the background noise that we all grew up with where I come from. And so it's really hard to hear in a way, because now as a policymaker, the thought of how you undo that it's daunting. So that's my immediate gut reaction.
Well, I'll follow up on that then, Claudia, because I kept thinking throughout your presentation that having a systemic response is the appropriate response. If we know, and that's why I think it's so important what you're sharing and what everyone here on this, this video cast is hearing, is that if there have been systemic racist work happening against people of color, then we have to break those down. We have to be systemic in seeing how we change those policies. And, I can speak from personal experience that, I'm in the middle of building low-income housing right now for Native people. And it is incredibly hard. Every possible barrier that can be thrown in my way is there. And so it's important that, we have some wonderful council members here who have helped me along the way, but breaking those down, trying to find new ways, reducing the barriers has got to be a priority as we move forward.
I'll also add, I think your report sort of highlights the disconnect between the headlines that we see and the lived experience of so many in Seattle, and assuming across the country as well. One of the latest headlines in the Seattle Times just 2 weeks ago highlighted the fact that the average income in Seattle was over 6 figures. But we know the reality in Seattle is that most families who are Black and brown cannot afford to live in the city. And we have seen the consequences of, racist redlining policies remain in statute today, when 75% of our city's residential land is still zoned for single family use. When you have African Americans earning just over $40,000 a year, and Native-led households earning 30% of what white households earn, there is no way that we can't say that those racist covenants are not still in effect when the average cost of a home in Seattle is $770,000. So I think what you've highlighted is the reason why we feel that there's a disconnect. We talk about prosperity and our city being an economic engine that's still running, and look at these, median incomes growing in the city. But the underbelly of those statistics shows exactly what you've talked about, and that's Black and brown families not being able to afford to live in the city, getting pushed out, and that not being a consequence of people's choices, but truly public policies that were made intentionally to exclude Black and brown families that remain in statute today.
Well, let me use that as a bit of a transition to you, Councilmember Mosqueda. How do you, as an elected official in Seattle, where discriminatory practices such as redlining and those restrictive covenants are a part of our history, how do you lead and then shape our housing policy?
Well, first, I just want to say what an incredible honor it is to be here with all of you at Town Hall and West Coast Poverty Center, Seattle for Everyone, Pacifica Law Group, and the 190 partners from Housing Development Consortium and this incredible lineup. Thank you, Michael and Councilmember Balducci, Colleen. What an incredible lineup this is. And if we were in person, I would just be giving this huge round of applause for this panel that you all have pulled together and all of the work that you all do on a daily basis. To answer your question, I really think of it as threefold. What responsibility do we as elected officials have? Number one, we have to name and own and call out these roots of continued segregation that we see playing out here in the city of Seattle and across the country. And then the last two, I think, are listening to those who are directly impacted, who have the lived experience of being impacted by the legacy of redlining racist covenants in the past. And as Mr. Rothstein has noted, bring in an intersectional lens to right historic wrongs, to address housing, and then to also make sure that there is not just changes to our zoning policy, but that we're doing this in a way that continues to create self-sufficiency, address the health consequences that we've seen from the legacy of these segregationist policies. Happy to elaborate on that a little bit more if you'd like me to.
Yeah, actually, if you wouldn't mind just taking a couple more minutes to do that, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So I mentioned this at the very beginning, but when we talk about what's occurring here in the city of Seattle, we are very proud of some of the small changes that we've made over the past few years, but we must recognize that we have exclusionary policies that remain in the books. And think about that. I said 75% of the residential land in Seattle is zoned exclusively for single family use. That means 3/4 of our residential land is illegal for us to build duplexes and triplexes, quads, apartment complexes. We have made it illegal for more inclusive, multi-generational, affordable housing options for individuals across our city. And as Mr. Rothstein says, Seattle has to recognize that when we have only allocated that amount of land for inclusive, diverse housing and excluded so many from the majority of our neighborhoods across the city, that we are very much carrying out the public policies that explicitly segregated members of our community from not being able to live in our city and not being able to live in certain areas of our city. This is true here in Seattle just as much as it is true for areas in the South and across the country. And it means that we also must recognize that this continuation of exclusionary policies that we have in the city is coupled with the fact that we are at a 40-year historic low for federal dollars that are being invested. We are systematically allowing for racist, exclusionary, segregationist policies to continue at the local level, just as dollars are being extracted and continuing to be extracted at the federal level. So this is a call for action, not just, here in the city to change one or two policies, but for us to work as a movement across the city and across the country, especially in DC, to get additional funding, but to also recognize that we have to act with urgency now, because that cavalry is not coming. I think in the city of Seattle, we need to recognize that the term single family is not actually accurate. The single family zoning does not describe the type of housing that I lived in when I had an apartment that was rezoned into single family, but it was still an apartment that was actually deemed illegal. When you create single family housing, you are intentionally trying to exclude those who are from African American communities, people of color, women, LGBTQ members, folks with disabilities, because it is more likely those folks who are more likely to be renters in the city of Seattle. And when we exclude folks from being able to have more affordable housing options throughout the city by precluding or making it illegal to build multifamily structures across our city, we are intentionally excluding those folks. I also think it's important for us to recognize that this is a continuation of government-sponsored segregation, as Mr. Rothstein has noted. He writes, prohibiting African Americans from buying or renting decent housing perpetuates second-class citizenship that was a relic of slavery. So let's let that sit in for a second. And we have to put that in context with what I just started with. When we say that the average cost of a house in Seattle is now $770,000. Just last week, that was the note that I saw from one of the real estate summaries that came across. And they noted as well that this extremely new high dollar amount associated with housing in Seattle is because of a severe inventory crunch. Then we actually have prevented people from being able to buy in the city. We've prevented people from being able to live in this city. And we've also done this knowing that those exclusionary policies are on the books as we've seen income disparities continue to rise. So while on paper, lending policies may have changed for certain banks or at least on paper, they've changed. Well, on paper, our public policies at the city level have changed. We have to recognize, though, that when the cost of housing is that extremely expensive, we are intentionally excluding members of our community, especially Black and Brown community members, from being able to stay in the city, afford to live in the city, be able to buy their first homes, be able to get out of generational poverty, to be able to create equity, and to be able to create stability. And I'll just sort of summarize, because I'm a public health advocate, and I appreciated Mr. Rothstein's mention of the impact on health as well. We talk a lot about how when we preclude people from being able to live in this city near opportunity-rich neighborhoods like grocery stores and good schools and jobs and childcares and parks and libraries, we are preventing people from having access to high opportunity neighborhoods as well. But it's also killing us. It is killing Black and Brown folks. Black and Brown folks have higher rates of infant mortality, and we die at earlier ages. And the inability to have access to stable housing, affordable housing, is a contributing factor to the social determinants of health that is killing us. It is killing our Black and Brown neighbors and our residents in the city of Seattle. And we must act with urgency to make sure that we address this issue, because it's not just a matter of making housing more affordable or available. It is a matter of making sure that we're addressing life or death situations, and you cannot be healthy without having a house. And Mr. Rothstein mentioned the fact that many affordable homes are in, or affordable housing options are sometimes in toxic neighborhoods. It's also the toxic stress that is imposed on our communities from having to constantly worry about being evicted, not being able to make rent, not being able to know if you're going to get the application to get accepted into a new rental unit. And when we see higher rates of rental units going to individuals from communities of color, we must recognize that our zoning policies, as one factor, must be addressed to actually address the legacy of segregation. And then lastly, this is not just about the intentional public policies that sort of were ignored for the 102 years, as Rothstein mentions, after the 1866 Civil Rights Act. This is about what the city of Seattle has intentionally done over the last 50 and 60 years, including in the 90s, where we expanded single family zoning instead of concentrated it or created more opportunities across our city. So the last two items that I had mentioned was for fixing this requires us to work in tandem with those with lived experiences who are experiencing this on a daily basis, and to bring an intersectional lens, because we know that the consequences of COVID have only exacerbated and exposed, not caused, the income inequalities that we're seeing right now or the health disparities that we're seeing right now, but have exposed the underlying inequalities in our existing system, and leading with folks who are from communities of color, leading with the directive from Black and Brown communities to not just change zoning policies, but to change our funding strategies, as Colleen mentioned, to actually get those dollars, break down those barriers, build the housing, create the dense, opportunity-rich housing that our city needs, and to do it in combination with making sure that people have access to childcare and good jobs and a union so they can speak up at the workplace and have self-determination, have retirement security, and get out of generational poverty and get away from that chronic stress, I think is some of the things that we need to take on as a system.
Thank you, Councilmember. One of the things that you mentioned, and Colleen, this is directed to you, communities that have been excluded. And we know Indigenous people have had a long history of being subjected to not only discriminatory housing policies and housing segregation, but also land theft and continued displacement. And as one who works with, an Indigenous community, can you talk about how you see these policies manifesting in the Indigenous community's ability to secure stable and affordable housing today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. And Councilmember Mosqueda, you're on fire. I'm getting all pumped up over here. Like, we have so much ahead of us. I want to thank everyone for being here, for paying attention to this incredibly important issue. I'm also glad to be here on Indigenous Peoples Day. I would like you all just to consider how often you actually see a Native American or Alaska Native American Indian person on a panel. And I think that is really wildly important for us to recognize how often the Native voice is not there, and that is a form of erasure. So I want to thank everyone who brought this panel together today and letting me and inviting me to be here. And to answer your question, Michael, I think that the first thing that comes to mind is a quote that my deputy director said to me years ago. His name is Derek Belgard, and we were sitting in our office talking about just how hard some of these policies were for our folks, how hard it is for our folks to get into any kind of housing. And he said, you know, prior to 1492, there was no homelessness in this country. And prior to 1492, we had a 100% success rate in housing our communities. And as you all know, the tragic story of how many of our communities were destroyed as colonizers moved into this country. Millions of Native people died. There was a genocide of people, culture, and our housing mechanisms. We lost so many wonderful, beautiful housing mechanisms, how we loved and took care of our community in our housing. And those were lost along the way. And that trauma just reverberates through our communities today. And in fact, here in Seattle, we know that it was in 1865, there was a Seattle City Ordinance that said Native people were not allowed inside the city of Seattle. And when we think about our incredibly high rates of homelessness today, I think we have to look back at that original ordinance that was one of the leading causes of the high rates of homelessness for Native people. So here in King County, Native people make up 15% of the homeless population, yet we make up less than 1% of the total population. This number and this data is reflective of cities around the country. So we have to consider, why are Native people so likely to be homeless in urban centers? And we know that it's because it's a reaction to the 1956 Urban Indian Relocation Act, where Native people were removed once again off of reservations and into urban cities like Seattle, San Francisco, LA, New York, all over the country. And when we got here, with the promise of job, with the promise of housing, if you lose that job, if you lose that housing, many, many Native people became homeless at that time. And I think that we all have to think about what that means for us. What does it mean that the first people of this country are the most likely to be homeless? I think that there is reflection that we have to do, and then there is action that we have to take. If we really understand these discriminatory policies that have ensured that people of color are going to be more likely to be homeless and less likely to get into housing, then we have to respond with an equitable lens. And that equitable lens requires special deals for Native people and for Brown people and for the BIPOC community. And you know, the reason we need to do that is because it's effective. About 3 years ago, my agency, the Chief Seattle Club, we received funding to do rapid rehousing work. So the city of Seattle said, yeah, we see this. We are going to give Chief Seattle Club funding to support getting Native people back into housing as soon as we can. Now our rapid rehousing program is the most effective in the system. It's the most effective because we understand our community. We understand the trauma. We understand the shame. We understand all of the things that have pushed and pulled at the Native community. And we come to our community with love. We come with open hands. We come with understanding, saying, we see you, we know you, we understand what you've been through, and we're gonna help support you through the system. And so our program is incredibly effective. And so when I like to remind people that the equity work that we're talking about is effective work, and it helps our whole system when we see different populations being given special attention to and brought into housing and security. And you might wonder, you know, how does the fair housing work? You know, we have wonderful programs that are coming up around the country that affirmatively market to people of color who've been pushed out of housing through gentrification and other mechanisms. So it is incredibly important that we see that people of color-led organizations are building housing. Not only are we building housing, but we're managing that housing. We are supporting the people that live in those buildings and finding ways to restore what was lost. What we know about Native people and Native housing is that we've lost so much along the way, but the Native community is incredibly resilient. I always remind people that in my own family, I am the descendant of 600 people that survived our genocide. And so there is an incredibly resilient community that has a lot to teach our system. And so we have to be heard, and we have to have people reaching out, ensuring that our voices are heard. So I could go on for quite a long while about this. Those of you who know me know that I could talk about this forever, but it is a passion. The Chief Seattle Club is building 230 units of housing that will be, the first 80 will open next year, and the rest will open in early 2022. So I'm glad I could be here, glad to get to be with this wonderful group of people, and glad to know that Seattle is a progressive city that loves their community, and we're going to do great work together.
Thank you, Colleen. Councilmember Balducci, you chair the King County Housing Committee, and not only do you see what happens in Seattle, but you see what happens throughout the entire county. So you have a great sense of the massive scale of the crisis now exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. Yeah. Is this history of discriminatory practices just a Seattle problem and an urban legend? How are you seeing the effects of some of these policies show up across the region?
Yeah, it is absolutely not just a Seattle problem. I think that all of King County, and for those who may not know, we have 38 other cities besides Seattle and King County, and a lot of unincorporated area as well. Our housing shortages and our housing inequities are absolutely a regional problem, and they spring from really similar causes throughout the county, and really beyond our county, because with our job centers being as concentrated as they are, we really have people who work or go to school in King County but live in Snohomish County, to the north, Pierce County, all the way, to Kitsap and out to the east as well. So it is a regional problem, and we formed a task force on this very question in 2017 and did some very deep research with partners from the city of Seattle and cities around the county. And we found a few really striking things. And one is we just have a housing shortage. We have been developing a lot of jobs, a lot of in-migration of work without keeping up the needs for housing. So you have this tremendous gap where we need over 150,000 housing units if we were to have a really healthy housing market balanced with our job market here in King County today. That grows over time to over 245,000 units if you go out 20 more years. And of course, that leads to a lot of cost burden. When people can't afford to live near where they work, and the market becomes distorted. And so we see over 100,000 households in King County alone that are what we call severely cost burden. That means they spend more than 50% of their income on the cost of housing every month, on rent or mortgage payment. That means that people are one major financial shock away from really losing their homes. And of course, not surprisingly, given that we have had the same types of exclusionary policies at work here as everywhere else in the country, we absolutely were not immune to steering and redlining and exclusionary covenants and sort of less facially obvious things like exclusionary zoning. The cost burden is not equally shared. If you were a Native American family in our county or a Black family in our county, you are more than twice as likely to be severely cost burdened as a white family. It's just a tremendously challenging problem and very concentrated in our most vulnerable communities and in our racial and divided by race. Of course, COVID has made this worse, as you noted. We know that the housing market has largely held. We're not seeing decreases in housing costs due to COVID, the way you did say in the last recession where the bubble was really based on housing costs. And yet we have just had hundreds of thousands of people. My last number I saw was by June in COVID, we had over 400,000 households that had somebody who had filed for unemployment. We know that the job sectors that were hit the hardest were in sectors like retail and restaurants and essential workers like that are, you have higher representation of racial minorities. So the problem just compounds. It just compounds. And if you look at it, King County has done some really great work over the years on these determinants of equity that Councilmember Mosqueda referred to, and that we look at how people are faring on various different measures throughout the county and show it on a map. And if you look at the map of King County on basically any measure of health or social equity, there is a racial disparity that shows up in the geography of where people live. Communities that are more likely to be Black and Brown communities in South Seattle or South King County have lower incidence of birth weights, lower employment figures, lower educational attainment, higher likelihood of not owning a home, which impacts intergenerational wealth, lower wages, and lower lifespans. And you could do this for any measure you want to look at. It's really something that we shouldn't be okay with. We should really care a lot more than sometimes it seems that we do in government to make this change. And I think we're going to talk about that at the end, but I want to just start by saying when we start to think about ways to change this, when you have baked this kind of racial disparities into your community as deeply as they are baked into most American communities, just having like a funding source, we're having a debate right now about implementing a new sales tax for homelessness housing. That's going to help. But it's not going to fix everything. Neither is better zoning policy. Neither is building more affordable housing near transit-oriented development, which we absolutely should do. We are going to need to sort of think intentionally about how we undo the systems that caused the disparities we see today. And that will mean that we have to be able to invest in communities that require more investment. And we have laws that say we can't do that by race in this state. So I think we're going to have to really start to build, as Professor said, a movement to get the legal supports to replace the legal deficits that we have been living with for so long.
Thank you, Councilmember. Okay, final question, and we're running short on time, so I'm just going to ask everyone, be pretty succinct with your answers. And Richard, I'd love for you also to contribute to this question. We know there are still structural racist policies in place today that impact access and attainability of housing. What type of sector and/or community work needs to be done to produce better outcomes for BIPOC residents? Who would like to go first?
Well, I'll jump in. I think there's two things that come to mind for me. One is addressing the trauma that many of our BIPOC community people have gone through around housing. With the looming eviction moratorium being lifted here in Washington State, it's something I'm thinking about all the time. That there are many folks who housing has been so uncomfortable, the process has been so hard that I worry about what will happen when they have to start paying back that rent, have to start managing those relationships with landlords. Like that to me is having a trauma lens around the way that we move forward is going to be really important. The other thing is I think that we have to remember that almost all of our low income housing and affordable housing has been created by white men. We have very few Black architects. We have very few Native architects. We barely make the charts. And so we need to think about housing that reflects cultural communities, and housing that that is going to provide a stabilization and warmth for our communities. I think there's a lot of connection there. The other thing I'll say finally is that there's also, you know, cultural ways of housing that we've just ignored. I think why can't we build like beautiful longhouse here in Seattle that houses a lot of people in a very specific Coast Salish way, and make it like beautiful and wonderful and a different kind of housing. We have to do it differently. What's happening is not working right now, right? We know that we don't have enough and that people are struggling. So there's got to be different ways to do it.
Thank you. Richard, Colleen. There we go. Claudia, were you saying something?
Yes, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. I was going to say I want to jump in now because I don't want to go after Councilmember Mosqueda. She has all the energy tonight. One of the themes I think I agree with is that trying to come up with government-sponsored or government-only solutions to problems that have been caused by government policy in the first place is probably not the path to success. I really believe we need to start finding ways, those of us who are in positions of authority and power, to start taking our hands off the wheel and letting the communities drive the car for themselves, if you'll pardon the SOV analogy. And we have some recommendations that we want to follow up on at our committee to try to start to build that with capacity building, with land transfers. There's been some discussions of supporting communities to build community-based housing near transit with anti-displacement strategies, with just holding our own selves accountable by creating toolkits and checklists that we have to use all the time when we engage with community or with housing policy to make sure we're not doing the shorthand stuff that entrenches further policies that have created racist outcomes. But there's a long way to go. I mean, we're really used to doing things the way we've always done them. And we do have a very large housing shortage. So to try to change direction and do it to scale, I think is going to be our big challenge. And it's something that will take the whole region, governments from all over King County, all over this area, and community working together in order to really make a difference.
Thank you again for the questions and the opportunity to participate in this panel. I want to lift up one more thing that Professor writes about. He says that we must not see desegregation as just desirable or as one more thing on our to-do list. He says we must see it as a moral obligation and a constitutional obligation to reverse it. And in doing so, I think that this has to be paramount. It needs to be at the top of our list, both as public policymakers and as advocates, to come together to work on this issue. As Professor Rothstein writes, it is one of the only areas where we continue to see segregationist policies remain in statute in public policy. We must address this with the urgency that it demands, because the consequences, again, are killing people, displacing people, pushing people into homelessness, and is providing state-backed justification to exclude people from our cities and housing. That is not okay. So one of the things that I want to uplift, and both Colleen and Councilmember Balducci mentioned this in their comments about investing in the culturally right solutions and taking our hands off the wheel and giving it to communities impacted. We must recognize that communities have solutions, whether it's Chief Seattle Club, whether it's Africa Town, organizations, advocates, individuals within communities, especially communities of color, have been long calling for solutions to break down barriers to investing and funding affordable housing and culturally relevant housing, and also fighting to make sure that they are in opportunity-rich neighborhoods, close to transit, as was mentioned, close to cultural centers. We have to make sure that those are the organizations and entities that are given the opportunity to get funding first. We have done some of that in the city of Seattle, and through policies that I've been helped champion along with community partners, like making sure that those who have been in the neighborhood get the chance to come back first, affirmative marketing, and Colleen, what's the name of the other public policy? Affirmative marketing and.
It's so funny. I was thinking about it today. I couldn't remember either, but community-based.
Community preference.
Community preference.
So we've done some of those things, but it's like the low-hanging fruit. So now let's turn over the reins to people who are from organizations who've been calling for those solutions for a long time to actually have the funding they need to actually leverage additional funding and change the zoning policies. Let's pass more progressive revenue. We did that with Jumpstart's payroll progressive revenue tax, which dedicates 70% of the funding in out years to affordable housing, because housing and the permanent supportive components, the operation and maintenance, have always been at the back burner. That is why we are on the 5th year of a housing crisis in the city of Seattle. And let's also make sure that as we're doing it, we're building green, affordable housing, fossil fuel housing with good union jobs, and making sure that we're investing in those Green New Deal principles as we create a more inclusive Seattle, which, by the way, housing by its very nature in dense cities is an environmental justice policy, because you're preventing people from having to commute hours in from being displaced. And I think those are sort of the 3 points that I'd like to lift up.
Great. Thank you. And Richard, final words.
Okay, let me make just a couple of points. One is the responsibility for remedying the segregation that we created does not just rest with the federal government, even though the federal government led. There are private actors as well. I mentioned before the specific developers who created suburbs on an all-white basis in the Seattle area. Those developers still exist today. Some of them do. If not, their successor firms do. They have an obligation, not just to now practice non-discrimination to people who happen to be able to afford the homes that are available. They have an obligation to contribute from the profits that they made historically from imposing segregation on your city. The real estate industry had a code of ethics that prohibited real estate agents from selling homes to African Americans in predominantly white neighborhoods. In 1948, the Seattle Real Estate Board expelled one of its members for having sold a home to an African American in a white neighborhood. Well, real estate agencies today have an obligation to contribute to the remedy, not simply by no longer discriminating, but by taking affirmative action that goes beyond simply non-discrimination into remedies for that. And that requires perhaps a private reparations fund that needs to be created by these real estate agencies and developers and banks, all of which were more than complicit in these federal policies. That's one point. Secondly, I just want to say that it is a terrible mistake to keep on talking about affordable and low-income housing as the same thing. Middle class, working class African Americans are segregated. And the subsidies that the federal government offers today are for low-income families only. There is no subsidy available for nurses, teachers, construction workers who cannot afford housing either in the current housing market. The private sector is not building housing for them. It's building housing, market rate housing for the affluent, and then with federal subsidies for low-income families. But there's a big missing middle. Most African Americans, I'll speak about African Americans specifically, most African Americans are not poor. Most African Americans are working class, and they can't afford housing either in the current market. And because of the historic patterns of segregation, policies of segregation, we have an obligation to remedy that exclusion as well, and not just the exclusion of low-income families. And finally, let me say that what I closed with before, and that is, I don't think it's the job of public officials to come up with these solutions. It's the job of a new civil rights movement of citizens to make it impossible for public officials not to come up with these solutions. No matter how well-intentioned those public officials, that I admire the ones that I'm on this panel with today, but no matter how well-intentioned they are, they're not going to be able to do this without a different political environment that can only be created by a new civil rights movement of activists, of citizens who are engaged in these issues. Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for taking time out tonight to join us. So thank you. And hopefully, can't hear the applause, but hopefully there's applause.
Well, a hearty thank you to Mr. Rothstein, Patience, Michael, Colleen, Councilmembers Mosqueda, and thank you to the many members of our community for joining us for this time of introspection. Tonight is one more step in our journey to rectify the transgressions of the past. It is long past time for us to stop structural and institutional racism and reconcile the inequities that we have created. As Patience said in her intro, tonight is the launch of Affordable Housing Week 2020. Please join us here in King County or in Whatcom County for many more events throughout the week as we heed the message from Mr. Rothstein, be a movement. On this Indigenous Peoples Day, I leave you with this wisdom from Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. It does not require many words to speak the truth. Have a good evening, and thank you for being with us tonight.